The evacuation sirens screamed across Tertius Prime. Maria clutched her daughter's hand as the transport bay doors groaned open. The acrid smell of burning promethium mixed with human sweat and fear. 300,000 civilians. 100 transports. 30 minutes before orbital bombardment. The math was simple. The choice was not. Move. Move. Commissar Vex's voice cut through the chaos. His bolt pistol gleamed in the emergency lighting. Children cried. Parents pushed. The elderly stumbled and fell. Maria's daughter looked up with wide eyes. "Mama, why are they leaving people behind?" The first transport lifted off. Faces pressed against windows, watching those left on the platform below. Vex raised his weapon toward the crowd. His finger found the trigger. "For the Emperor," he whispered. "And for the greater good." The bolt round echoed through the bay. Panic erupted. Bodies surged forward like a breaking dam. The weak were trampled. The strong climbed over the fallen. Maria felt her daughter's hand slip from hers. "Elena!" She screamed into the crushing mass of humanity. Another transport departed. Then another. The orbital bombardment timer showed 27 minutes. Vex methodically selected targets from the crowd. Each shot created more space, more order, more death. "Please." An old man reached toward a closing transport door. "I have grandchildren." The door sealed shut. His fingers scraped against cold metal. Maria found Elena pressed against a support pillar, gasping for air. Blood trickled from her nose. "We have to get on the next one," Maria whispered. But the next transport was already full. And the next, and the next. The timer showed 15 minutes. Vex's ammunition ran low. He drew his chainsword instead. The blade roared to life. Teeth spinning, hungry. "Order must be maintained," he announced to no one in particular. A young father carrying twin babies approached the final transport. The ramp began to close. "Wait!" He ran faster. "Please!" The ramp continued its mechanical ascent. He threw one baby upward. Hands reached down and caught the child. The second baby slipped from his exhausted arms. The transport lifted off. 10 minutes remained. Maria looked at the empty landing bay, at the bodies scattered across the deck plates, at her daughter's trusting face, at Commissar Vex, still standing guard over nothing. "Mama," Elena whispered. "Are we going to die?" Maria opened her mouth to lie, to comfort, to promise everything would be fine. But the orbital bombardment timer showed 8 minutes, and in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is no mercy for the innocent. So what happens when an entire world burns, and you're the one left behind to watch it die? In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But war is not fought in the void. It bleeds into homes, into schools, into the arms of mothers clutching children who will never see another dawn. Across a million worlds, the Imperium of man stretches like a dying god. 10,000 years of endless conflict, where entire planets burn in the span of an afternoon, where cities that housed billions become ash in the wind. The histories speak of heroes, of space marines and their legendary battles, of Primarchs and their glorious crusades. They rarely mention the baker's daughter who watched her father's flesh melt from chaos fire, or the factory worker who held his wife's hand as alien spores consumed her lungs, or the teacher who barricaded her classroom while demons tore through the walls. These are the forgotten voices of the 41st millennium. The 99% who carry no bolter, wear no power armor, command no armies. They are the civilians, the ordinary human beings caught in the crossfire of gods and monsters. When apocalypse comes to a world in Warhammer 40K, it arrives with the weight of inevitability. Tyrannid hive fleets that devour entire systems, chaos incursions that twist reality itself, orc wars that turn civilization into a playground of violence, Necron tomb worlds awakening after 60 million years of slumber. The smell of burning promethium mingles with human fear. The temperature drops as orbital bombardments blot out the sun. The ground trembles beneath the weight of Titan war machines whose footsteps crack the foundations of hope. For civilians, survival is not about heroism. It's about hiding in sewers while your city becomes a war zone. It's about choosing which child to save when you can only carry one. It's about watching your neighbor transform into something that wears his face, but hungers for your soul. The Imperium's response is as brutal as the threats it faces. Exterminatus, the complete annihilation of infected worlds. Better to murder 10 billion innocents than risk chaos spreading to 11 billion more. This is not a story about Space Marines saving the day. This is about what happens when the day cannot be saved. When ordinary people face the end of everything they've ever known. When the sirens first wailed across Hive City Tertius, most citizens thought it was another drill. The Planetary Defense Force had run dozens of emergency protocols that year. False alarms about orc raids, phantom signals from dead space. But the screaming that followed wasn't part of any simulation. That was just the beginning. Marcella pressed her face against the Hab block's reinforced window. The air recyclers wheezed behind her, struggling with the acrid smoke that seeped through every seal. 3 days since the first screams echoed through Sector 7. Below, the underhive burned. Orange flames licked at the industrial towers like hungry tongues. The metallic taste of fear coated her mouth as she watched her world collapse. "Mama, why won't the lights come back?" Her daughter's voice cut through the mechanical groaning of failing systems. Marcella turned from the window, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. The power grid had failed when the first wave hit. Not raiders, not orcs. Something worse. Something that turned people inside out. Marcella had seen it happen to old Henrik 3 floors down. One moment he was hammering emergency boards over his door. The next, his skin split like overripe fruit. What crawled out still wore his face, but it smiled too wide. The emergency vox crackled to life. Governor Malthius's voice, usually so commanding, now trembled with barely contained panic. "Citizens of Tertius Prime, remain in your homes. Do not open your doors. Do not trust familiar faces. The Imperium will..." Static swallowed his words. Marcella's hands shook as she checked their food stores again. 2 protein bars, half a water recycle unit. Maybe 3 days if they rationed carefully, if they lived that long. The temperature had been dropping since yesterday. The Hab block's heating system failed along with everything else. Her breath misted in the stale air as frost began forming on the inner walls. Outside, something howled. Not human, not animal. Something caught between. Marcella pulled her daughter close, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest. The little girl's skin felt cold as plasteel. "The Emperor protects," Marcella whispered. The words felt hollow, meaningless. Where was the Emperor when the darkness came? Where were his angels? A wet scraping sound echoed from the corridor outside their door. Drag. Pause. Drag. Something heavy being pulled across the metal flooring. The sound stopped directly outside their Hab unit. Marcella held her breath. Her daughter's eyes went wide with terror. 3 soft knocks echoed through the reinforced door. Then Henrik's voice, cheerful and warm. "Marcella, "It's me, dear. I've brought food for little Senna. Fresh protein. Still warm, but Henrik had been dead for 2 days." Marcella clamped her hand over her daughter's mouth, feeling the child's scream vibrate against her palm. The knocking came again, patient, persistent. "I know you're in there, Marcella. I can smell your fear. Sweet as copper. Sweet as blood." The voice was Henrik's, but underneath, something else spoke. Something that had learned to wear human words like a mask. Marcella backed away from the door, her bare feet silent on the cold metal floor. That's when she heard it, the same wet scraping sound, coming from behind her, from inside the HAB unit. She turned slowly, her daughter still clutched in her arms. The ventilation grate hung open like a metal mouth. Something glistened in the darkness beyond, but the real horror hadn't even begun. Marcus pressed his daughter closer as the evacuation sirens died mid-wail. The sudden silence cut deeper than any scream. In the underhive of Tertius Prime, when the warning system stopped, it meant one thing. The authorities had given up. "Daddy, why did the noise stop?" Elena whispered, her small fingers clutching his torn work shirt. He couldn't tell her the truth. That somewhere above them, in the command bunkers, Imperial officers were sealing blast doors. That their sector, home to 12 million souls, had just been written off as acceptable losses. The acrid smell of burning promethium drifted through the ventilation shafts. Emergency lighting flickered red against the rusted walls, casting dancing shadows that looked like reaching claws. Around them, other families huddled in the maintenance tunnels. Mrs. Chen rocked her infant son, humming a lullaby that couldn't mask his hungry cries. The Volkov twins, barely 16, stared at their father's empty chair with hollow eyes. They'd been waiting here for 6 hours. 6 hours since the first orbital bombardments shook dust from the ceiling. 6 hours since the Vox channels went dead. Marcus felt the vibration before he heard it. A deep rumble that made his teeth ache. The children felt it too. Elena's grip tightened. The baby stopped crying. "What's that sound?" Old Henrik asked, his weathered hands trembling. Marcus knew. Every factory worker on Tertius Prime knew that sound. It was the grinding of massive gears, the scream of metal against metal. It was the sound of the planetary defense turrets rotating. But they were pointing the wrong way. The turrets weren't turning to face the sky anymore. They were turning inward, toward the city, toward them. The Imperial doctrine was clear. When a world fell to corruption, when the enemy gained a foothold, sometimes salvation required sacrifice. Sometimes you had to burn out the infection, even if innocent people were still inside. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling Elena's heartbeat against his chest. In the distance, he could hear the first civilians breaking down the sealed doors above, their screams echoing through the ventilation shafts. Panic was spreading like wildfire through the underhive. But down here, in this forgotten maintenance tunnel, time moved differently. Here, a father could hold his daughter and pretend the world wasn't ending. Here, Mrs. Chen could sing her lullabies. Here, they could still believe in tomorrow. The rumbling grew louder. Dust rained from the ceiling in steady streams. Elena looked up at him with trust that broke his heart. "We're safe here, right, Daddy?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but the words died in his throat because that's when he heard it. The unmistakable whine of charging plasma coils. The planetary defense grid was almost ready to fire. Governor Matthias Vex had ruled Tertius Prime for 37 years. His gilded throne room, carved from imported marble, had witnessed 1,000 ceremonies of imperial glory. Now it reeked of smoke and fear. The first sign wasn't the orbital bombardment. It wasn't even the screaming from the lower hives. It was the silence from the astropathic choir. That psychic lifeline to Terra had simply stopped, my lord, his aide whispered, sweat beading on pale skin. The PDF garrison has abandoned their posts. The Arbites precinct went dark an hour ago. Vex's fingers traced the golden aquila on his ceremonial scepter. For 4 decades, that symbol had meant order, law, protection. Citizens knelt before it in reverence. Today, it was just metal. In the Underhive, where 20 million souls pressed against each other in perpetual twilight, the news spread like wildfire. No more food shipments. No more Medicaid supplies. No more enforcers patrolling the narrow corridors. Maria Hendricks clutched her infant daughter closer as the crowd outside grew louder. Through paper-thin walls, she could hear her neighbors arguing over the last protein bars in Sector 7. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, the prayer tasting like ash. But where was he now? The breakdown began in minutes, not hours. 40,000 years of imperial conditioning. The sacred hierarchy, the unquestioning obedience, crumbled like ancient parchment. Vendor stalls erupted into riots. Citizens who had queued peacefully for rations yesterday now trampled each other for scraps. The elderly were pushed aside. Children disappeared in the chaos. Sergeant Cale of the local PDF watched from his abandoned checkpoint as a mob tore apart the statue of Saint Celestine. Bronze limbs scattered across a blood-stained rockcrete. He'd sworn an oath to protect these people. Now he couldn't even protect himself. "Orders, sir?" his last remaining trooper asked, voice cracking. Cale stared at the madness below. Without the Imperium's iron grip, humanity revealed its true face, desperate, savage, utterly without mercy. "Save yourself," he said, dropping his lace gun. In the governor's palace, Vex made his final transmission. His voice, once commanding and sure, now trembled like autumn leaves. "This is Governor Vex of Tertius Prime. Imperial authority has collapsed. Civilian population is in full revolt, requesting immediate evacuation for essential personnel." Static answered him. Below his tower, fires bloomed like crimson flowers across the city. The screaming had stopped, replaced by something worse. Laughter, the kind that comes when sanity finally breaks. Vex looked at his ceremonial bolt pistol, its weight suddenly comforting in his trembling hands. Outside his chamber, footsteps echoed in the marble halls. Heavy boots, many of them, coming closer. But they weren't his guards. The door handle turned with a soft click. Maria had known Tobias for 15 years. They'd shared morning prayers at the shrine. Their children played together in the Hab block corridors. When her husband died in the factory collapse, Tobias brought her family rations for 3 weeks. Now he stood in her doorway, holding a bloody knife. "The voices told me," he whispered, his eyes reflecting the emergency lumens. "They told me about your family, about what you really are. This is what happens when the warp bleeds through during an apocalypse. Reality doesn't just break, it turns neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. The chaos corruption doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It seeps into minds like poison gas, invisible and deadly. One moment you're sharing your last can of corpse starch with the family next door. The next, you're convinced they're demons wearing human skin." Maria backed away, her children clinging to her legs. The familiar smell of Tobias, machine oil, and cheap glow sticks now carried something else. Something rotting. "Tobias, please. It's me. It's Maria." But the man in her doorway wasn't Tobias anymore. not entirely. The warp whispers had been growing stronger for days. First, just paranoid thoughts. Why did the Hendersons get extra water rations? Why does old Garrett watch my children so closely? Then came the dreams. Visions of his neighbors' true faces, writhing tentacles beneath human masks, eyes that burned with unholy fire. By the third day, the voices were screaming, "Kill them before they kill you. Save your family. Save humanity." Across the Hab block, similar scenes played out in dozens of apartments. Mrs. Chen strangled her grandson with her own rosary beads. The Kowalski twins turned on each other with kitchen knives. Father Matthias set fire to his own chapel with the congregation still inside. This is the true horror of chaos corruption during an apocalypse. It doesn't just destroy, it corrupts the very bonds that hold society together. Maria's neighbor, the man who'd helped her fix her water recycler just last week, raised the knife higher. His face twisted into something unrecognizable. "The Emperor protects," he hissed. "And I am his instrument." The irony was perfect and terrible. In trying to serve the Emperor, Tobias was doing exactly what the Dark Gods wanted. Every act of violence, every betrayal, every broken trust fed the warp entities growing stronger in the shadows. Maria grabbed her children and ran for the emergency stairs. Behind her, she heard Tobias kicking down her door, screaming about purification and holy duty. The stairwell echoed with similar sounds. Screaming, breaking glass, the wet sounds of violence. She reached the landing and froze. Blood covered the walls in arterial sprays. Bodies lay twisted in unnatural positions. And standing among the carnage, smiling with perfect serenity, was Father Matthias. His robes were soaked crimson. His hands dripped red. "Maria," he said gently, "I've been waiting for you." But the real horror hadn't even begun. The blast doors of Hive Tertius had held for 73 days. 17 million civilians pressed against reinforced adamantium, their breath fogging the metal in desperate clouds. The air recyclers wheezed. Children cried in languages that would die with them. Magistrate Helena Voss stood before the command cogitator, her hands trembling as she read the final transmission from the outer districts. The words burned into her retinas. All perimeter defenses compromised. Xenos breach imminent. Behind her, families huddled in corridors designed for cargo, not human habitation. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with recycled air and fear sweat. Mothers clutched infants who hadn't seen sunlight since the invasion began. "Magistrate," whispered Tech Adept Caney, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused. "The Tyranid bioships are descending. Estimated impact, 14 minutes. Helena's throat constricted. 14 minutes to decide the fate of 17 million souls. The safe zones had been humanity's last desperate gambit. Massive underground complexes, sealed bunkers, floating Hab platforms suspended in the void between worlds. Each one promised salvation. Each one became a tomb. On Cadia Prime, the fortress monastery of Saint Celestine had sheltered 3 million refugees when the Chaos fleets arrived. The civilians watched through reinforced viewports as demons tore reality apart outside. Then the walls began to bleed. The screaming started from within. The survivors spoke of children's laughter echoing from empty corridors, of shadows that moved against the light, of mothers who no longer recognized their own offspring. Helena remembered the Vox recordings from Mordian 7th. 100,000 civilians sealed in the planetary governor's bunker, convinced they were safe. The Orc way couldn't breach their defenses, but orcs don't need to breach what they can bury. The greenskins simply collapsed the mountain above them. 1 billion tons of rock became a gravestone. The Vox channels carried final messages for 3 days. Pleas for rescue. Prayers to the Emperor. Then silence. The cogitator chimed. 12 minutes. Open the emergency channels. Helena commanded, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Across the hive, 17 million people heard their magistrate's final words. Citizens of Tertius, we have served the Emperor faithfully. We have endured. But our time grows short. The children stopped crying. Even they understood. Remember that we chose hope over despair. We chose unity over chaos. We chose to stand together at the end. The blast doors groaned. Something massive struck them from outside. Helena closed her eyes, thinking of her daughter's face, of morning prayers in the cathedral, of a universe where children could play in gardens instead of dying in bunkers. The metal began to buckle. 17 million people held their breath as one. But what crawled through those twisted doors wasn't death. It was something far worse. The screaming stopped 3 days ago. Now there's only the wet sound of boots on bodies, the metallic tang of blood mixing with burning promethium, the acrid smoke that makes your eyes water and your throat close. On Hive-world Tertius, the chaos invasion has reduced humanity to its most primal equation: survive, or feed the corpse fires. Maria Voss clutches her infant daughter closer. The baby hasn't cried in hours. Good. Crying draws attention, and attention means death. She steps over the remains of her neighbor. Yesterday they shared ration cubes. Today she's searching his pockets for ammunition. The moral calculus of apocalypse is brutally simple. Your conscience weighs nothing against your child's heartbeat. 3 blocks away, Commissar Thorne watches through his scope. He's been tracking this group of survivors for 2 days. Standard protocol demands he execute them. Civilians who've abandoned their posts, deserters from the manufactorum. But something stays his trigger finger. Maria finds a las pistol, half charge, maybe 6 shots. She checks the power cell with practiced efficiency. When did she learn to do that? When did survival become second nature? The baby stirs, makes a small sound. A cultist rounds the corner, flesh hanging in ribbons, eyes like black stars. He sees them. Maria doesn't hesitate. The last bolt takes his head clean off. The body hits the ground with a wet thud. Thorne lowers his rifle. Interesting. The real horror isn't the monsters. It's how quickly we become them. Maria steps over the cultist's corpse, searches his robes, finds a combat knife. Still warm from its previous owner's grip, she's killed 4 people today. Yesterday, she couldn't even kill a rat in her kitchen. Evolution happens fast when extinction is the alternative. Thorne speaks into his Vox. Commissar Thorne to command. Civilian Sector 77 Alpha shows no signs of life. Recommend orbital bombardment. He watches Maria disappear into the rubble. She's carrying the knife now, leading a group of 12 survivors. They move like soldiers. But here's what Thorne doesn't report. Maria isn't just killing cultists anymore. 2 hours ago, she executed an injured man who was slowing them down, put the knife between his ribs, whispered an apology as the light left his eyes. The group didn't protest. They understood. Survival demands sacrifice. Usually someone else's. Thorne follows at a distance. Professional curiosity, he tells himself. But something else gnaws at him. Recognition, maybe. He's seen this transformation before. Good people becoming necessary monsters. The Imperium's greatest recruitment tool isn't propaganda. It's desperation. Maria's group finds shelter in a collapsed cathedral. The Emperor's golden eagle lies shattered in the dust. They use the pieces as weapons. Even faith becomes currency when the price is blood. Thorn makes his decision. He approaches their position. Hands visible, weapon lowered. "Citizens," he calls out. "I'm Commissar Thorn. I'm here to help." Maria emerges from the shadows, knife ready, eyes like winter. "Help?" she laughs. The sound echoes off broken stone. "Where were you 3 days ago?" Thorn looks at her blood-stained hands, at the survivors behind her, at the baby who's learned not to cry. "I was following orders," he says. "So were we," Maria replies. "Until we learned orders don't stop bullets." But what she does next will make Thorn question everything he believes about duty, survival, and the price of staying human. Because sometimes the real enemy isn't the one trying to kill you. Governor Vex had ruled Tertius Prime for 37 years. His portrait hung in every hab block, his voice echoed from every voxcaster. The Emperor's will, channeled through his steady hand. Then the Tyranids arrived. The first sign wasn't the screaming, it was the silence. The planetary defense grid simply stopped responding. No alarms, no emergency broadcasts, just dead air where the Imperium's voice once commanded. In the Underhive, Scavenger Kira pressed her ear to the rusted Vox unit. Static. For the first time in her life, the Emperor's servants weren't watching. "They've abandoned us," whispered her brother Tam, his words cutting through 20 years of Imperial conditioning. Above them, in the Spire districts, the wealthy felt it first. Their private security forces, well-fed, well-armed Arbites, simply vanished overnight. No explanations, no farewells. The golden elevators that connected their towers to the surface sat empty, their machine spirits dormant. Lady Castellan Vera stood at her penthouse window, watching the lower hives burn. Orange flames licked at the darkness below. The acrid smell of burning promethium mixed with something else, something organic. "Where are the PDF?" she demanded of her trembling aide. "Gone, my lady. They took the last transport off-world 6 hours ago." 6 hours. The Imperium had written off an entire world in 6 hours. In the middle hives, the revelation spread like plague. The administratum offices stood empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws. Citizens who had waited in line for ration cards found nothing but abandoned desks and scattered papers. The truth hit them in waves. The tax collectors who had squeezed every throne from their meager wages. The Arbites who had enforced every petty regulation. The commissars who had executed deserters and heretics. All gone. They had been left to face the great devourer alone. Merchant Havoc clutched his trading license. Worthless parchment now. 40 years I paid their bribes, he muttered, watching looters smash his storefront. 40 years of loyalty. The smell of fear sweat mixed with burning plastic. Civilians who had never questioned Imperial authority suddenly understood a terrible truth. They had been expendable all along. In the depths of the Underhive, where Imperial law had always been a distant rumor, the gangers laughed. They had known this day would come, when the Imperium's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold mathematics beneath. 10 billion souls. Acceptable losses. Kira found her first weapon in an abandoned Arbit station. A riot gun, still warm from recent use. The irony wasn't lost on her. The tools of oppression, now instruments of survival. But as she loaded the weapon, a new sound echoed from above. Not the familiar drone of Imperial aircraft. Something else. Something hungry. The real horror hadn't even begun. The apocalypse doesn't announce itself with fanfare in the Underhive of Hive Tertius. It whispers through rusted ventilation shafts. It seeps through corroded metal floors as crimson droplets. Mara clutches her infant daughter closer as the screaming echoes from 17 levels above. The baby's skin burns with fever, another mouth among billions that the Imperium has already written off. Down here in the forgotten bowels of the Hive City, 10 million souls huddle in perpetual twilight. They've never seen real sunlight, never breathed unfiltered air. Now they never will. The Tyrannid bioships blot out Tertius Prime's star. But in the Underhive, darkness feels familiar. What doesn't feel familiar is the taste of copper in the recycled air. The way the walls seem to pulse with an alien heartbeat. They're coming down the main shaft, whispers Jorik, pressing his ear against the trembling metal. His cybernetic arm sparks, jury-rigged decades ago from scavenged parts. The Underhivers know survival. They've carved existence from nothing for generations, eating corpse starch, drinking filtered sewage, fighting over scraps of metal and hope. But this is different. Mara remembers her grandmother's stories about the last purge. How the Arbites came down with flamers, cleansing entire sectors of undesirables. How families disappeared into the recycling plants. At least then, the enemy was human. The chittering grows louder, closer, a sound like breaking glass mixed with hungry laughter. Children press against their parents in the makeshift shelter, a collapsed manufactorum that once produced lasgun power cells. 43 souls breathing the same stale air, sharing the same terror. Old Henrik clutches his stub rifle. 3 bullets left. He's calculating which 3 people matter most. That's what the apocalypse does to civilians in Warhammer 40K. It strips away everything except the mathematics of survival. Mara feels her daughter's pulse against her chest, rapid, fragile, like a caged bird. The baby doesn't cry anymore. Even infants learn silence in the Underhive. The metal groans above them. Dust rains down like gray snow. Jorik's cybernetic eye flickers red in the darkness. Movement in Sector 7. He breathes. Multiple contacts. But it's not Tyrannids that emerge from the shadows. It's other Underhivers. Families like theirs. Hollow-eyed, desperate, armed with makeshift weapons and the kind of hunger that goes beyond food. In the Underhive, the apocalypse doesn't just bring alien monsters. It brings out the monsters in men. The leader steps forward, a woman with ritual scars covering her shaved scalp. Her followers carry improvised blades. Their eyes shine with the fever of the truly desperate. "We know you have water," she says. Her voice echoes off the metal walls. And food. And space. Mara's grip tightens on her daughter. Henrik's finger finds his trigger. 43 souls in this shelter. 37 in theirs. The mathematics of survival just got more complicated. But what happened next would haunt the Underhive's few survivors forever. The evacuation sirens had been screaming for 3 hours when Helena Voss pressed her face against the reinforced glass of Terminal 7. Below, 30,000 civilians crushed against the boarding gates like water against a dam. The stench of unwashed bodies and fear sweat rose through the ventilation systems. Children's cries echoed off the vaulted ceiling, a symphony of desperation that made Helena's teeth ache. "How many transports do we have left?" she asked without turning from the window. Captain Moros checked his data slate with trembling fingers. 17. Maybe 18 if we can get the Gloriana's engines back online. Helena did the math in seconds. 30,000 souls. 18 ships with a maximum capacity of 800 each. 14,400 seats. 15,600 people would die here. The Tyrannid bioships had been spotted 6 hours out from the system's edge. Their shadow in the warp grew stronger with each passing minute, a psychic weight that pressed against every human mind like a migraine made manifest. Helena watched a mother lift her toddler above the crowd, desperate to get the child closer to the boarding ramp. The woman's face was streaked with tears and dust from the collapsed hab blocks. "We could implement the priority protocols," Moros suggested quietly. "The priority protocols. Save the young. Save the skilled. Save those who could rebuild. Leave the rest to feed the hive fleet." Helena's reflection stared back at her from the glass, hollow-eyed, gaunt from weeks of rationing. She looked like a corpse already. Below, someone had started singing, an old Imperial hymn about the Emperor's protection. Other voices joined in, creating a fragile harmony that rose above the chaos. They still believed they would be saved. All of them. Helena closed her eyes and felt the weight of 15,600 deaths settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. The temperature in the terminal was rising. Body heat and broken climate systems turned the air thick and soupy. Sweat ran down Helena's spine in cold rivulets. "Ma'am," Moros whispered, "the first transport is ready for departure. We need to start the selection process." Helena opened her eyes and watched the singing crowd below. A little girl with pigtails sat on her father's shoulders, clapping along to the hymn. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The girl looked up at the observation deck and waved. Helena raised her hand and waved back. Then she turned to face the hardest decision any human being could make. But the choice was taken from her when the lights went out. The evacuation sirens had been wailing for 17 hours when Mira finally understood. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't temporary. Her homeworld of Tertius Prime was dying. The spaceport stretched before her like a vision of hell. 3 million civilians pressed against barricades, their voices creating a wall of sound that made her teeth ache. The smell hit her next. Unwashed bodies, fear sweat, and something else. Something metallic. Blood. "Move. Keep moving." Imperial Guard troopers shoved families forward with rifle butts. Children screamed. Mothers clutched infants to their chests, their knuckles white as bone. Mira watched a man collapse 20 meters ahead. Heart attack, maybe, or just despair. Nobody stopped to help him. The evacuation ships loomed overhead like metal mountains, massive, imposing, salvation wrapped in rust and prayers. But there were only 12 ships for 3 million people. The math was simple, brutal, final. Lottery numbers. "Present your lottery numbers." The amplified voice cut through the chaos. Mira's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, fingers closing around the small metal disc. Number 847-293. She'd memorized it, prayed over it, dreamed about it. Around her, families checked their numbers with trembling hands. Some wept with relief. Others simply stared at the discs in their palms like they held their own death sentences because they did. The Imperial bureaucrats had been efficient. She'd give them that. When the Tyranid hive fleet appeared at the system's edge, they'd calculated exactly how many citizens they could save. Assigned numbers. Created order from chaos, but efficiency and mercy were different things entirely. Numbers 1 through 250,000. Proceed to loading Dock Alpha. The crowd surged forward. Mira felt herself lifted off her feet, carried by the desperate tide of humanity. The heat was unbearable, the pressure crushing. Someone grabbed her arm. "Please." The woman's face was streaked with tears and dirt. My number is 2,847-391. But my daughter." She held up a small girl, maybe 6 years old. Her number is 67,094. Take her, please. Mira stared into the child's eyes. Wide, trusting, uncomprehending, the woman pressed the metal disc into Mira's free hand. Take her number. Save yourself. The weight of the disc felt like a planet. Behind them, the crowd was thinning. The lucky numbers had been called. The unlucky ones, they just stood there, watching the ships prepare for departure. Some were already walking away, back to their homes, to wait for the end. Others weren't so accepting. Mira heard the first gunshot echo across the spaceport. Then another. The riots had begun. She looked down at the two discs in her hands. Her salvation, the child's future. The woman was already disappearing into the crowd, pushing her daughter towards the loading docks. Numbers 67,000 through 68,000. Final boarding call. Mira's legs moved without conscious thought. But as she reached the checkpoint, she realized something that made her blood freeze. The Imperial Guard weren't just checking numbers. They were checking faces against a database. And the little girl's photo was about to appear on their screens. The evacuation sirens had been screaming for 3 days straight. Mara clutched her daughter's hand as they pushed through the crush of bodies at Spaceport Tertius Prime. The air reeked of unwashed flesh and fear sweat. Above them, the last civilian transport hung like a metal savior against the burning sky. Only 300 seats. 50,000 people. The math was simple. The choices were not. "Mommy, I can't breathe," whispered Kira, her small voice lost in the roar of desperate humanity. Mara lifted her daughter onto her shoulders, feeling the girls trembling through her thin jacket. That's when the Planetary Defense Force arrived. Booted feet rang against metal grating as the soldiers formed a perimeter around the transport's loading ramp. Their laser guns gleamed under the emergency lighting. Their faces were stone. "Citizens of Tertius," the commander's voice boomed through voxcasters. "By order of the Imperial Governor, evacuation priority will be determined by contribution assessment." Mara's blood turned to ice water. Contribution assessment. She'd heard those words before, on other worlds, in other disasters. It meant money. It meant connections. It meant the poor died first. The crowd surged forward anyway. Mothers screamed their children's names. Fathers threw themselves against the barriers. The elderly were trampled underfoot, their cries swallowed by the mob's desperation. Mara watched a well-dressed merchant family walk calmly through a side entrance, their passage smooth as silk. Behind them, a woman in factory coveralls beat her fists against the barrier until her knuckles bled. "Please," the factory worker sobbed. "My son is only 6. The soldier didn't even look at her. Above, the transport's engines began their warm-up cycle. The sound was beautiful and terrible. Salvation's song played for an audience that would never hear it up close. Mara felt Kira's small hands grip her hair. "Are we going to die, Mommy?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from the burning city beyond. That's when Mara noticed the man beside her. Thin face, worker's clothes, but his eyes. His eyes held something different. Not desperation. Purpose. He was counting the soldiers, timing their patrol patterns. Other workers had noticed too. They were spreading out, positioning themselves near the barriers. Their movements were too coordinated to be random. The merchant families continued their leisurely boarding. Children with full bellies and clean clothes disappeared into the transport's belly, while hungry eyes watched from the crowd. Mara felt something hard pressed into her palm. A small metal object. She looked down, a grenade pin. The thin man's lips barely moved. "When the lights go out, run for the ship. The transport's boarding ramp began to rise. 50 meters away, salvation was departing. Mara looked at her daughter's trusting face, then at the grenade pin in her palm. How many would die so her child could live? The emergency lights flickered once. Then the spaceport plunged into darkness. The evacuation ship's cargo hold reeks of unwashed bodies and fear. 47 days since the Tyranid swarms devoured Hive City Tertius. The lucky ones made it to the ships, but luck runs out when you're carrying 10,000 souls in space meant for 3. Navy Captain Mordian stands before the massive blast doors, watching families huddle in the amber emergency lighting. Children press against their mothers. Old men clutch faded picked captures of homes that no longer exist. The ship's oxygen recyclers are failing. Mordian's aide whispers the calculations. At current consumption, they have 6 days of breathable air. The nearest Imperial world is 12 days away. The math is simple, brutal, undeniable. Half the civilians must die so the other half can live. Sir, the aide's voice cracks. We need to make the selection. Mordian watches a little girl share her ration bar with her younger brother. The boy's ribs show through his torn shirt. Neither child knows they're competing for the right to breathe. The captain's hand hovers over the cargo bay controls. One button opens the outer doors to the void. Instant death for whoever's inside. Merciful compared to slow suffocation. But who decides? Age? Health? Usefulness to the Imperium? A woman in the crowd recognizes his uniform. Hope flickers in her eyes. She believes the Navy will save them all. Mordian thinks of his own daughter, safe on distant Terra. These could be her classmates, her friends, her future. The recycler alarm grows louder, more insistent. 6 days of air. 10,000 people. The cold mathematics of survival. He could divide them randomly, draw lots, make it fair. But fairness is a luxury the dying universe cannot afford. The captain studies the crowd, categorizing them like cargo manifests. Young workers who might rebuild. Pregnant women carrying the next generation. Children who haven't yet learned to hate. And the others, the old, the sick, the broken, the ones the Imperium has already written off. Mordian's finger finds the intercom button. His voice echoes through the hold, calm and steady as a funeral dirge. Citizens of the Imperium, we face a difficult journey ahead. The crowd looks up with desperate trust. They still believe someone else will make the hard choices. They still believe they're all going home. But in the grim darkness of the far future, hope is the cruelest lie of all. Every disaster reveals who we really are when the lights go out. Every crisis strips away the comfortable illusions we tell ourselves about fairness and justice. In our own world, when resources grow scarce and systems collapse, who do we save first? Who gets the ventilator? The vaccine? The last seat on the evacuation transport? We like to think we're different from Captain Mordian, that we'd find another way. But when the air runs out and the math becomes unavoidable, what separates us from the monsters we create in fiction? The universe doesn't care about our moral calculations. It only counts the bodies. Subscribe if you dare to see how this choice reshapes everything we thought we knew about survival. The convoy stretches across the ash-choked highway, like a dying serpent. 50 days since the sky burned red. 50 days since the screaming stopped echoing through the hive spires. Maria clutches her ration card, her third identity this month. The Imperial seal still bleeds fresh ink. Around her, 10,000 survivors shuffle forward. Their eyes hold the same hollow stare she's seen in every mirror, every puddle of contaminated rainwater. The smell of unwashed bodies mingles with promethium fumes. Children whimper in languages that no longer have homeworlds. Sanctuary ahead. The Voxcaster crackles. Processing begins at dawn. But Maria knows what processing means now. She's seen the cattle cars, heard the sermons about necessary sacrifices and the Emperor's mercy. Watched families torn apart at checkpoints, sorted like grain from chaff. The strong go to labor camps. The weak feed the corpse starch machines. The children disappear into Skolam programs that strip away everything they were. "Mama," her daughter whispers, tugging at Maria's sleeve. "Why are those people crying?" Maria follows her gaze to the processing station ahead. Massive gates yawn open like a predator's maw. Steam rises from hidden vents, carrying the metallic tang of industrial machinery. And something else. Something organic and wrong. The line moves faster now. Imperial guards in gas masks gesture with shock mauls, herding civilians toward separate queues. Medical examinations, loyalty screenings, genetic purity tests. Maria's hands shake as she reads the signs. Able-bodied workers, breeding stock, material reclamation. The same categories she'd seen spray-painted on refugee camp barracks. The same words that turned human beings into resources. Next. A servo skull hovers before Maria's face, scanning her retinas. Red light bathes her features as data streams across its display. Subject: suitable for protein extraction. Offspring: Skolam candidate. Maria's world tilts. Her daughter's hand slips from hers as guards step forward. "Wait," she gasps. "Please, she's all I have left." The shock maul's kiss silences her protests. As consciousness fades, Maria realizes the horrible truth. There was never any sanctuary, never any salvation, only survival, and the price the Imperium demands for it. The processing continues. 10,000 souls reduced to numbers on a manifest. 10,000 stories ending in the same mechanical efficiency that built this galaxy of endless war. In the distance, new convoys approach. Fresh meat for the grinder. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, even hope is a luxury the desperate cannot afford. Today we scroll past images of refugee camps and processing centers. We see statistics instead of stories, numbers instead of names. We tell ourselves it's different now, more civilized, more humane. But when survival becomes the only virtue, when efficiency trumps empathy, how many steps separate us from that ash-choked highway? Every swipe is a choice. Every view, a witness to what we're willing to ignore. Subscribe if you dare to keep watching. Some truths refuse to stay buried.